In this video, I'm going to expose the shocking truth about waste, fraud, and abuse, and straight up scams in the chronic care management and remote patient monitoring space. Over the last 6 years, I've spent my life building a CCM service-based company. And in that time, I've come across tens, if not dozens of various different scams and people that are billing fraudulently for these programs. It's such a pivotal program, and it would be such a shame if it was negatively impacted. And so in this video, I think it's really important to expose the various different scams that are out there so that if you are running one of these scams, you should know to shut it down. If you are somebody looking for services, you should know which vendors to look for and some huge red flags that you can look out for. And if you're in the government and you're now looking for ways to optimize and ways to find efficiencies and cut down on waste, fraud, and abuse, this is a great way to understand exactly what's going on in the space. Now, what is CCM? Unfortunately, an incredible amount of patients in our country, pretty much every single senior patient, has 2 or more chronic conditions, like maybe diabetes or hypertension. These conditions, when they go unmanaged, can become very, very expensive, not to mention really bad for the patient's life. It's very difficult to live with badly managed chronic conditions. It also costs the healthcare system a ton of money because when patients are not well managed, they end up in the ER very often, they're in the hospital, and that costs the system a lot of money. And so both patients and doctors and Medicare are extremely incentivized to try to keep their patients out of the hospital. And so this is what CCM was created for, where a doctor can establish what's called a care plan, which is a plan of care for the patient that will outline what are this patient's challenges, what are their goals, what are we trying to accomplish with them based on the chronic conditions that they have. And then that patient can be reached out to once a month proactively by a care coordinator. And that care coordinator can talk to the patient and try to see if they have all the medications they need, if they have any questions. Maybe they fell and they twisted their ankle, and that's going to be something that might get exacerbated and land that patient in the hospital. But now that they're talking to their care coordinator, they can get them to come and see their primary care doctor. And so by proactively reaching out to patients, you are able to help them manage their own conditions much better. And that has proven to keep patients out of the ER, thus reducing costs pretty significantly for the healthcare system at large, as well as obviously creating a better quality of life for all those patients. And so that's really the thought process that went into creating chronic care management. It's an incredible program, but unfortunately, it's being abused, and we need to talk about it. One of my earliest experiences and stories that comes to mind when I think about waste, fraud, and abuse in CCM is a few months after I took over the company that I built into Proviva Health Group. I was trying to sell CCM services to a doctor, and I sat down with this doctor and explained the services to them, and they told me that they were actually already billing for these services. And I said, that's really incredible. How many patients do you have? And they had a couple thousand patients. And I said, that's great. How many patients are you billing CCM for? And they said, about 100. And I said, well, you have all these patients that could find value from the service. Why are you only billing 100? And the doctor's answer was that the reason why they were only billing such few patients was because they were not billing them correctly. They weren't actually compliant. They weren't documenting. They weren't actually creating the care plans. They weren't doing a lot of the requirements of the program. They were just billing for the patients because they assumed that they were kind of doing, chronic care management with those patients. And so they would rather bill fewer patients just to stay under the radar so they don't get looked at or audited, rather than expanding the program but doing it correctly. So this was one of those experiences that was kind of interesting because on the one hand, if this doctor would be audited, they would probably get in trouble. But if you take a step back, this doctor was actually probably doing a good job. They were reaching out to their patients, they were coordinating, they just weren't doing it compliantly. Then you have folks that are, they found, so the way that chronic care management works is you have the first code is 99490 for the first 20 minutes. And then if the patient's more complex and requires more time, they said, okay, we'll pay you for that. So there's an additional code that you can bill if you hit 40 minutes. And then there's a third code that you can bill if it goes over 60 minutes. And so there are tons of CCM operations out there that they just look at them and they go, oh, there's 3 billing codes. And then they just spend 60 minutes on every single patient, no matter the complexity level. Now they're billing for that, and they're just deciding that they're complex because they took 60 minutes. I sat a couple weeks ago with somebody that was telling me if we can give him this care code technology that we've built, if we could give it to him to increase the intelligence of his people, but turn off any efficiency. I don't want them to be able to auto-generate their documentation. I don't want them to be able to auto-generate anything that will help them from a time perspective, because this guy was trying to hit 60 minutes on every single patient. That should be an immediate red flag. I mean, from what we see at Proviva, maybe 15% of patients go hit 40 minutes, and probably 3 to 5% of patients are going to hit that 60, 90 minutes and beyond. And I think that if you're someone that's looking to get a vendor for CCM, a good question would be how many of your patients hit 60 minutes or 40 minutes? And if they gleefully tell you, oh, we actually hit that with 100% of our patients, as if that's a selling point, you should know that they're probably not looking out best for patient care. They're just looking to bill the maximum amount, which is not the intent of the program. So if you're seeing all your patients at 60 minutes, probably not. There's another giant issue with folks that are sending the care overseas. And this is something I've come across many, many, many times over the last 6 years with companies that are actually a vendor. So they are a company that a doctor will hire to provide outsourced chronic care management services. You've got a lot of folks that are getting these contracts and they're charging money for CCM. And then what they do is they find a team overseas in India or the Philippines or somewhere overseas, and they have folks calling out of there, and then they're billing for the time of the folks that are overseas for the purposes of chronic care management. A couple months ago, I was speaking to somebody that was running such a, let's call it operation. And I told him, you're committing fraud. This is fraudulent. And he said, no, it's not fraudulent. And he started explaining to me that because basically the doctor is paying him and his company is based in the US. So the government's paying the doctor is paying him. So they're all good. And then he is paying a separate entity that's overseas and they're the ones doing the work. But the actual dollars from the doctor who's getting paid by the government is going to him. And I was like, dude, you're when people reach around their whole head to scratch their ear instead of doing this, that's what you're doing. And that is definitely fraud, probably leading abuse. There is regulation around this that any non-emergency care that is being paid for by federal dollars, so the dollars end up paying for that care and it's non-emergency, must be provided from within the US. So that is a law. Even if you've done this, you've found this wild workaround in a way that you can check off all the boxes that you don't get put in prison, essentially, I still think that you need to think back to what is the intent of the program? Are you actually providing value to the patient? When CMS comes and knocks at your door and says, hey buddy, we gave you 100 grand, we gave you 200 grand, we gave you $1 million for these chronic care management services, how did you positively impact the patient? If you don't have a good answer for that question, you should not be doing it. End of story. A couple weeks later, I was talking to a very senior executive at CMS, and I just asked this person point blank if this is legal or not, and it is not legal. So if you're doing CCM overseas, you shouldn't be doing it, and you're asking for an audit. But that's very different than, let's take another scenario where a couple years later, I had a client approach me who is a pain medication doctor. This doctor was trying to do CCM, and they were trying to do it themselves, and we looked at their processes, and it was just, it just made no sense. This doctor just saw a cash grab. Hey, are you kidding me? If I make a couple phone calls a month, I can bill, $60 for the first 20 minutes, another $40 for the next 20 minutes on top of that, another, $40 or $50 for the next 20 minutes on top of that. I can make all this money. And all I have to do is have patients. And so this random pain management doc was literally billing CCM for patients based on diabetes codes and hypertension codes and different diseases that a pain management doc should have no business billing for. So I think when it comes to doctors that have no business billing for CCM, but they're billing anyway just because they have access to the patients, that also I would say falls under fraud, because 90% of the time those doctors are not actually providing any real value to the patient's life, and they have no business billing for CCM. The point of CCM is to actually help the patient manage those conditions. If you're a random pain management doc, you're not actually doing that. So you should not be billing for CCM. That extends very quickly into the area of abuse, because there's an entire giant cohort of people that are now billing for CCM without even doing anything. In fact, I was speaking, this is about a year ago, I was talking to an administrator of a long-term care facility, and this guy tells me that one day the FBI knocks on his door, and he's like, what can I do for you guys? And they start looking around, they start asking questions, and they finally explained to him that they were cracking down on fraudulent CCM billing. And the billing was for his patients in his facility. And it turns out that he had no idea that a separate vendor who never asked him, never spoke to the patients, but a vendor that had access to the patient information because they were a random service vendor or whatever they did, they were literally just taking patients' profiles, billing them for CCM, never speaking with the patients, never spoke to the facility, and they were just billing for CCM. He was absolutely mind blown and shocked that somebody, that a vendor would have the audacity to just bill for his patients without even, forget about speaking to him about this supposed relationship, wasn't even speaking to the patients at all. That is absolutely abuse, and unfortunately, there's a ton of that. It's pretty terrible. This whole experience over the last 6 years of watching, on the one hand, the incredible impact that a program like chronic care management can have on a patient's life, and then on the flip side, witnessing all the fraud, all the abuse, and all the waste that's going on in the space, that's really what drove me to build this second company that I built, which is called CareCo. I believe that between the AI revolution and the value-based care revolution, we're coming to this point where efficiency is actually going to be rewarded, and we're going to stop caring about things like time-based codes, and we're actually going to start caring more and more about actual value that you've provided to the patient. And that's really important because there also is an inverse incentive for folks to hit as much time as possible because that's how they get paid. So if you can take away the time requirements and then just, hey, if you can prove value at different complexity levels, then you'll get paid more, then that's a really positive thing. And we're seeing that now with the advanced primary care management programs. One of the really fundamental things that we're exciting about building CareCo is that it is impossible to commit fraud if you're using CareCo. Literally impossible, because CareCo analyzes every single conversation. We know what you talked about intelligently, and we're automatically tracking every single thing in that process. And so it is literally impossible to commit fraud. And on the flip side, you're going to get the ultimate efficiencies for the patient because we analyze everything and we augment every piece of that workflow that's possible to augment while leaving you with just caring for the patient. And so that's why we built CareCo. I think it's really exciting to see these two revolutions of both AI and value-based care come together and start aligning incentives. And I think the only question that the government needs to ask itself is, as we start moving in this direction, how are you going to audit? What are the things that you're going to put in place to make people prove value? What are those actual metrics that you're going to want to see that will prove success in a model like the advanced primary care model? And I don't think that's fully clear yet. And I think that CMMI and CMS needs to do some more work on clarifying what those metrics are, because it is incredible for you to take out silly, arbitrary things like time-based codes and only focus on quality to the patient. But if you're going to do that and you don't want to increase fraud, then you have to be very clear on how you are going to allow people to prove that they're actually providing value to the patients. I hope that we can make some progress on cutting back on waste, fraud, and abuse in programs like chronic care management, and get back to a time when these programs are being reimbursed to the right people for the right reasons. And at the end of the day, the bottom line is keeping patients out of the hospital and creating better health outcomes for the millions of patients across this country.